I want to begin this story before the success, before the airplanes, before the island, before the smile that the world now recognizes as confidence. I want to begin it in a place that feels uncomfortable, because that is where most real lives actually start. Richard Branson did not grow up feeling special. He grew up feeling slow, not lazy, not careless, slow in a way that makes teachers sigh, slow in a way that makes classrooms feel like traps. Words on paper did not behave for him. Letters moved when they should have stayed still. Sentences refused to line up. Instructions felt like riddles written for someone else. Dyslexia did not come with a label back then. It came with judgment. So when Richard failed to read at the same pace as other children, the conclusion was simple and cruel. He was not smart. He was not focused. He was not trying hard enough. And over time, when a child hears that often enough, he stops arguing. He starts adapting. School became a daily exercise in survival, memorization without comprehension, guessing without confidence, smiling so no one would notice the panic underneath. Teachers measured intelligence by speed, and Richard was always behind the clock. At home, expectations were not low, but they were different. His mother believed in throwing children into the deep end and watching whether they learned to swim. When Richard was young, she sent him on long bike rides alone, told him to find his way back without help, not to toughen him up, but to teach him something school never did. Resourcefulness. That trait would matter later, much later. At the time, Richard only knew that the world felt easier outside classrooms than inside them. Conversations made more sense than textbooks. Ideas felt clearer when spoken aloud instead of written down. And slowly, something began to form in his mind, though he could not yet name it. He did not think differently because he was gifted. He thought differently because he had no other option. By his teenage years, frustration turned into restlessness. Sitting still felt unnatural. Listening to lectures felt like being trapped inside someone else's thoughts. The system asked him to fit into a mold he could not even see, let alone enter. So he began to look elsewhere for validation, not approval, opportunity. At 16, while most students were memorizing answers for exams, Richard made a decision that terrified adults around him. He left school, not because he had a detailed plan, but because staying felt like a slow erosion of self-worth. Dropping out did not feel rebellious, it felt necessary. The world outside did not welcome him with open arms. There was no applause for leaving the system. There was confusion, concern, quiet disappointment. People assumed he had chosen the easy way out. In reality, he had chosen uncertainty. With no degree, no credentials, and no clear path, Richard leaned into the one thing he trusted: curiosity. He started a small magazine aimed at young people, filled with voices ignored by mainstream media. It was chaotic, improvised, underfunded, but it was alive. For the first time, he felt engaged. The magazine did not succeed financially. In fact, it barely survived. But something important happened. Richard realized he could create platforms, not just participate in them. He could connect people. He could see gaps where others saw rules. Money was always short. Bills stacked up. Stress became a familiar companion. There was no safety net, no prestigious backup plan waiting if things failed. And things did fail, again and again. At one point, he faced legal trouble over unpaid taxes. The weight of responsibility arrived early and without warning. This was not a glamorous rebellion against the system. This was consequence. And yet, even here, Richard noticed something. Failure outside the system felt different from failure inside it. Inside, failure labeled you. Outside, it instructed you. He began to understand that systems reward conformity before competence. They prefer predictability over imagination. And for someone like him, that was never going to work. So he stopped trying to be impressive. He started trying to be useful. This mindset would become the foundation of everything that followed. Not dominance, not perfection. Utility. If he could make something simpler, cheaper, more human, people would notice. That belief led him into music, not because he loved records more than others, but because he saw how broken the industry was. Artists underpaid, customers overcharged, middlemen protected by tradition rather than value. Virgin Records was not born from ambition. It was born from irritation. Why does it have to be this way? That question followed Richard everywhere. It guided his decisions more than confidence ever did. He did not feel smarter than competitors. He felt less patient with inefficiency. But before the empire, before the brand, before the myth, there were moments of embarrassment that no biography glamorizes. Being fired, being dismissed, being told, directly and indirectly, that he was out of his depth. People did not see a visionary. They saw a dropout playing entrepreneur. What they missed was that Richard had already made peace with not fitting in. Rejection did not scare him the way it scares those who rely on permission to move. He was not fearless, he was uncontained. And that distinction matters, because courage is not loud, it does not announce itself. It often looks like stubborn curiosity combined with a refusal to retreat. By the time Virgin began to grow, Richard still carried the voice of every teacher who underestimated him. It did not disappear, it softened. It became background noise rather than command. He learned not to fight doubt directly. He worked around it. And that perhaps is where this story truly begins. Not with success, but with a young man who learned to build paths because the main road never opened for him. This is only the beginning. By the time people began noticing Virgin as a name rather than a curiosity, Richard Branson had already internalized a quiet truth. Momentum is fragile. One wrong move can shatter it. One careless promise can collapse trust. Growth is intoxicating, but it is also merciless. Virgin Records expanded not because Richard mastered finance, but because he listened obsessively. He listened to artists who felt trapped by contracts. He listened to customers frustrated by inflated prices. He listened to employees who wanted autonomy instead of hierarchy. Listening became his substitute for formal education. Yet the business world does not reward listening alone. It demands proof, numbers, control, authority. And this is where friction emerged. Banks viewed him with suspicion. Investors questioned his seriousness. Established executives dismissed him as a hobbyist with good timing. Dyslexia still followed him, not as a diagnosis, but as an assumption that he lacked discipline. He learned quickly that credibility is often borrowed before it is earned, so he borrowed it creatively. He hired people smarter than him in areas he didn't understand. He gave them room to operate. He resisted micromanagement, not because he was enlightened, but because he knew his limits. Delegation was not strategy, it was survival. Virgin did not grow in straight lines. It zigzagged through mistakes, near misses, and cash shortages that kept Richard awake at night. One bad quarter could have ended everything. One misjudged expansion almost did. But instead of retreating into caution, Richard leaned into boldness. Not recklessness, but calculated audacity. He understood something subtle about attention. People remember those who challenge giants more than those who quietly compete. That insight pulled Virgin into airlines. Launching an airline without experience, without planes, without institutional support looked absurd. Industry insiders laughed openly. The risks were enormous, the margins thin, the competition ruthless. But Richard was not trying to dominate aviation. He was trying to expose its arrogance. Airlines treated passengers like inconveniences. They hid behind complexity. They justified poor service with scale. Richard saw opportunity where others saw inevitability. Virgin Atlantic was conceived not as a transport company, but as a statement that businesses could be human, that efficiency did not require coldness, that systems could be redesigned from the customer backward. The early days were brutal. Delays, mechanical issues, regulatory pressure, lawsuits from competitors who wanted him gone. Every week seemed to introduce a new reason to quit. He didn't. Not because he believed success was guaranteed, but because he believed retreat would validate every insult ever thrown his way. Persistence became personal, and yet the cost was real. Stress carved into his health. Responsibility aged him quickly. Public confidence masked private exhaustion. There were moments when even he wondered whether stubbornness had crossed into blindness. What saved him was not vision, but values. Richard refused to sacrifice people for profits. When times were hard, he protected employees even when advisors urged layoffs. He believed morale was not a luxury, it was infrastructure. That belief was mocked, then it was studied. As Virgin diversified into trains, telecommunications, space, and hospitality, critics accused him of overreach. They expected collapse. They waited for the inevitable headline. Instead, they watched a pattern repeat. Virgin would enter stagnant industries, disrupt expectations, improve experience, then step aside when growth plateaued. Richard did not cling to control. He treated companies like living systems, not trophies. And something else evolved within him during these years. His relationship with failure changed. Early on, failure felt like confirmation of inadequacy. Now it felt like feedback from reality, impersonal, useful. He learned to fail fast, publicly, without shame. That terrified traditional leaders. It liberated teams. Dyslexia, once a source of embarrassment, became an advantage. He processed information visually, intuitively, holistically. He asked naive questions that exposed flawed assumptions. He connected dots others ignored. What the system labeled deficiency had quietly become differentiation. By the time Richard was labeled a billionaire, the title felt distant from his internal identity. He still saw himself as the boy who struggled to read, who dropped out because classrooms felt like cages. Wealth did not erase that memory, it contextualized it. He realized that systems are not neutral. They reward certain minds while sidelining others. His life became a counterexample, not to prove the system wrong, but to prove alternatives possible. This understanding reshaped how he spoke to younger generations. He did not encourage rebellion for its own sake. He encouraged alignment. Find where your nature meets a real need. Build there. Because fitting in is not the goal. Functioning authentically is. The world began calling him fearless. He knew better. Fear was always present. It simply stopped being a dictator. And as his influence expanded, Richard faced a final, unexpected challenge. Knowing when to step back. Knowing when boldness must give way to stewardship. That lesson did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly. As the years accumulated, Richard Branson began to notice something unsettling. The very traits that once allowed him to move freely were becoming harder to protect. Scale brings weight, attention brings expectation, and success, if left unchecked, quietly demands conformity. Virgin was no longer an underdog, it was an institution. That realization disturbed him more than any financial risk ever had. Institutions defend themselves, they become cautious, they prefer predictability over curiosity. Richard feared that if he wasn't careful, the very system he once challenged would slowly grow inside his own companies. So he did something unusual. He decentralized power. Rather than building a single towering corporation, he split Virgin into many semi-independent businesses. Each had its own leadership, its own culture, its own rhythm. He trusted people to run them, even if that meant losing control. Control, he had learned, is often an illusion anyway. This structure confused analysts, it frustrated critics, it terrified accountants. But it aligned with Richard's philosophy. If you want innovation, you must tolerate divergence. Uniformity suffocates imagination. Of course, decentralization comes with risk. Some ventures failed publicly. Virgin Cola never dethroned Coca-Cola. Virgin Brides collapsed under operational complexity. Virgin Cars quietly disappeared. Each failure invited ridicule. Yet Richard responded differently than expected. He spoke openly about what went wrong. He laughed at himself. He treated missteps as tuition rather than tragedy. That posture disarmed critics more effectively than defensiveness ever could. What people misunderstood was that Richard was not chasing perfection. He was chasing momentum of learning. Every attempt sharpened judgment. Every loss clarified values. He also began using his visibility for something larger than commerce. Philanthropy was not an afterthought for him. It was an extension of his discomfort with imbalance. Extreme wealth alongside extreme suffering never sat right in his mind. He believed business could be a force for good, but only if leaders resisted the temptation to hoard influence. He advocated for environmental responsibility long before it became fashionable. He spoke about prison reform, drug policy, education, global health, not as a politician, but as someone who had lived outside neat categories. Many accused him of being naive. Others said he was exploiting causes for branding. He accepted both criticisms without retreating. He had learned long ago that approval is volatile, alignment is steadier. Privately, Richard continued to wrestle with self-doubt. Dyslexia never disappeared. Reading long documents remained exhausting. Public speaking required preparation others never saw. Mistakes in interviews were frequent, but he stopped apologizing for them. He understood that transparency disarms shame. By acknowledging his limits openly, he removed their power to define him. That openness gave others permission to admit their own constraints. In a world obsessed with polish, authenticity became his advantage. As he aged, Richard became increasingly reflective. He thought about legacy not in terms of monuments, but in terms of permission. Had he given people permission to question norms, to fail publicly, to design lives that didn't fit templates? He hoped so. He also recognized something subtle. Systems don't change because they're challenged. They change because enough people quietly build alternatives. His life was not a protest against education, employment, or structure. It was evidence that multiple paths can coexist. Dropping out of school did not make him superior. It made him responsible for his own learning. Being fired did not liberate him. It forced him to redefine worth outside job titles. Those lessons hardened gently over time into wisdom. Near the height of his wealth, Richard made a decision that surprised many. He pledged significant portions of his fortune to charitable causes. Not out of guilt, but out of clarity. Excess, he believed, dulls empathy. Freedom was always his real currency. Freedom to try, freedom to fail, freedom to walk away from ventures that no longer aligned with his values, freedom to speak honestly even when silence would be safer. That freedom traced directly back to a teenage boy who walked away from school uncertain, underestimated, and quietly determined not to let other people's definitions imprison him. He never tried to prove teachers wrong. He simply built a life where their judgments no longer mattered. And as the world continued to label him a billionaire, an adventurer, a disruptor, Richard Branson held on to a simpler identity, a curious human who refused to shrink to fit expectations. In later years, Richard Branson found himself thinking less about expansion and more about preservation, not of wealth, but of spirit. He had seen too many founders become prisoners of the very systems they built, their curiosity dulled by responsibility, their playfulness buried beneath protocol. He did not want that ending, so he leaned further into experimentation, not to prove relevance, but to remain engaged. Space exploration with Virgin Galactic was not a branding stunt to him. It was a continuation of a lifelong question. What happens when we stop accepting limits simply because they are old? Critics mocked the ambition. They said space belonged to governments and billionaires with something to prove. Richard listened, then proceeded anyway, not because he believed success was guaranteed, but because exploration itself mattered. The failures were public. Rockets crashed. Timelines slipped. Costs ballooned. Each setback was amplified by media eager for spectacle. The scrutiny was relentless, yet his response remained consistent: responsibility without drama, reflection without retreat. He understood that when you challenge boundaries, you invite friction. That friction is not a sign to stop. It is a sign that you are touching something real. As his ventures matured, Richard became increasingly focused on people rather than products. He invested time in mentoring, listening to young founders who reminded him of himself, not confident, not polished, just restless. He told them what no one had told him early enough. You don't need to fit the system to succeed. You need to understand it well enough to navigate around it. Rules are tools, not truths. He also warned them of something he had learned painfully. Success amplifies who you already are. If you are insecure, it magnifies insecurity. If you are generous, it expands generosity. Money does not change character, it reveals it. Looking back, he acknowledged mistakes without self-flagellation, trusting the wrong people, overestimating readiness, underestimating complexity. Each error sharpened discernment. What he did not regret was courage. Courage to be misunderstood, courage to look naive, courage to build without consensus. Dyslexia, once a silent burden, became a public part of his narrative. He spoke openly about it, not to inspire pity, but to dismantle stigma. He wanted children who struggled in classrooms to know that intelligence has many languages. Reading speed is not wisdom. Grades are not destiny. The world often celebrates outcomes while ignoring processes. Richard's life pushed back against that distortion. His success was not a straight line upward. It was a series of experiments, many of which failed quietly. What made the difference was not brilliance. It was momentum sustained by belief that work could be joyful, that leadership could be humane, that ambition did not require cruelty. As he slowed down physically, his mental clarity sharpened. He saw patterns earlier. He spoke less, listened more. He valued silence, not as absence, but as space for thought. And when asked what advice he would give his younger self, he did not say work harder or think bigger. He said something simpler: trust your curiosity. It will take you further than fear ever could. The boy who struggled to read had built platforms that reached millions. The dropout had created opportunities for thousands. The one labeled not academic had taught the world a different lesson, that systems are not final. They are temporary arrangements waiting to be improved. And perhaps the quietest truth of all is this: Richard Branson never tried to become extraordinary. He simply refused to accept a definition of ordinary that excluded him. This is where the story settles, not with triumph, but with continuity. A life still curious, still experimenting, still unwilling to shrink. When people look at Richard Branson's life from a distance, they often compress it into a highlight reel. A school dropout becomes a billionaire. A dyslexic child builds a global brand. A man fired and dismissed creates companies that reshape industries. It sounds clean, almost scripted, but lived life is never clean. Up close, his journey feels messier, quieter, and far more human. Long stretches of uncertainty. Decisions made without assurance. Nights where confidence was borrowed from hope rather than evidence. What sustained him was not optimism, but permission. Permission he gave himself to move without validation, to try before being ready, to act before being certain. That permission is what most systems withhold. Schools reward correctness more than curiosity. Corporations reward obedience more than imagination. Society rewards stability more than alignment. For someone like Richard, those incentives were never going to fit. So he built a different relationship with risk. He did not romanticize it. He respected it. Risk was not something to chase recklessly. It was something to engage consciously. Failure in that context became informative rather than humiliating. Being fired was not a verdict. Dropping out was not an ending. Poverty was not an identity. They were circumstances, not conclusions. He learned that confidence does not arrive fully formed. It is constructed gradually through repeated exposure to discomfort. Each attempt strengthens a muscle no classroom can train. As years passed, his definition of success continued to evolve. Early on, it meant survival. Then independence. Later, impact. Eventually, coherence. To live in a way where curiosity, compassion, and courage could coexist without contradiction. Richard never claimed that everyone should drop out of school or reject structure. His life was not an argument against systems. It was an argument for flexibility, for acknowledging that human potential does not express itself uniformly. Some people thrive inside frameworks. Others need space. Wisdom lies in recognizing which environment nourishes you rather than punishes you. He also understood that rebellion without responsibility is chaos. What gave his defiance credibility was follow-through. He did not just question industries. He built alternatives. He did not just criticize leadership. He practiced it. And perhaps the most enduring lesson of his life is not about business at all. It is about dignity. Dignity in admitting limitations. Dignity in asking for help. Dignity in choosing joy even when seriousness seems more respectable. The child who struggled to read never stopped learning. He simply learned differently. The young man who was told he would never succeed never stopped listening. He just listened inward more than outward. If this story offers anything to those who hear it, let it be this: you do not need permission to begin. You do not need consensus to continue. And you do not need to resemble anyone else's definition of capable to be effective. Systems will always exist. So will their blind spots. Progress happens when someone quietly steps into those blind spots and builds something useful. Richard Branson did that not once, but repeatedly. Not because he was fearless, but because fear never got to vote. And that is the kind of courage that outlasts applause.